Number 12. Katsuren Castle Roman Coins. A Roman coin under a medieval Okinawan castle should be easy to dismiss, a fake, a planted object, a labeling error. But Katsuren Castle leaves a harder possibility on the table. The evidence may be real, and the clean version of the past may be what fails. In December 2013, archaeologists excavating the site uncovered 10 corroded copper coins from roughly a meter below the surface, in a context dated to the 14th or 15th century. X-rays were used to look through the corrosion. 4 appeared to be Roman coins from the 3rd, 4th centuries. 1 was Ottoman, carrying a date equivalent to 1687. Outside specialists said the weight, dimensions, and imagery matched real examples. Even the archaeologists did not claim Romans in Japan. They pointed instead to a missing route, a broken chain of exchange. The harder issue sits underneath the coins themselves. How does complex knowledge survive for centuries, then disappear so completely that only contradictions are left behind? And who benefits when that happens? Now strip it back. No headlines, no theories, just the trench. It is December 2013. You are standing inside the stone ribs of Katsuren Castle, high on the east coast of Okinawa. The walls rise in pale curves of Ryukyuan limestone. Winter air comes off the Pacific, sharp with salt. The ground underfoot is packed and uneven, mottled with roots and broken shell. A worker sets down a trowel, kneels, and scrapes at a patch of darker soil near the floor of the excavation. Nothing about it looks dramatic. Just dirt. Just another thin layer in a site that has already yielded what archaeologists expected from a gusuku linked to the 15th century and to Amawari, the lord whose name still clings to this place. The trench is only about a meter down. That meter matters. Above it is the present. Here, in this narrow band of earth, is the castle before its military life ended in 1458. Before defeat, before fire, before silence. The soil is dense, compacted by centuries. Every scrape slows under caution. A brush clears a round edge no bigger than a fingernail, then another, then another. At first, they do not even look like coins. They look like clots. Green-brown discs fused with corrosion, their surfaces eaten flat, the metal rough as old bark. One excavator rolls a piece gently into the light, pinched between gloved fingers. No clear portrait, no clean inscription, just a circle where a circle should not be. The fine bag opens. The first disc drops in with a tiny sound you would miss if you were not listening for it. Then the count rises. 2, 4, 7. By the time they stop, there are 10. The trench suddenly feels smaller. You can see it in the way people lean in without speaking. 10 copper coins from inside Katsuren Castle is not impossible. Katsuren was no backwater. In the 15th century, it sat inside a maritime world that stretched across East Asia. Ships moved through it. Tribute moved through it. Brokers, ceramics, metals, and goods passed hand to hand across water. Foreign objects can travel very far when ports stay busy long enough. So nobody says anything reckless. Nobody says Rome. Nobody says empire. Nobody says impossible. Because by eye, there is still nothing definite to say. The coins are bagged, labeled, logged with the layer they came from. A layer believed to belong to the 14th or 15th century. That is the first fixed point. The second is their condition. The surfaces are too damaged to read cleanly. If there are faces, letters, or dates, they are buried under corrosion. So the scene moves from trench to lab, from scraped soil to imaging screens, from hands and brushes to X-rays. You watch the metal show itself in negative. Lines appear where the eye saw only decay, raised shapes, a border, the ghost of an image pressed into copper centuries ago, then carried farther than anyone in the room can explain. Measurements are taken, diameter, weight, thickness. Photos are compared to known examples. Outwardly, nothing dramatic happens. No gasps, just the quiet procedural rhythm of specialists trying very hard not to outrun the evidence. But the evidence does not stay still. One coin begins to look Roman, not vaguely old, Roman, then another, then another. By the time outside comparisons are made, 4 of the 10 appear consistent with coins of the Roman Empire, dated to the 3rd and 4th centuries CE. On one, the imagery is linked to Constantine I, a ruler of an empire centered nearly 9,000 kilometers away, appears here, not in a museum tray or a private collection, but in excavated soil from an Okinawan castle. Even then, you could still try to force the scene back into shape. Objects travel, collections get mixed. A single coin can drift across centuries without bringing an army behind it. But there is another disc in the set, another corroded circle from the same recovery. When its details come clear, the trench tilts again. It is Ottoman. Not medieval Ottoman in some loose sense, not merely Islamic. An Ottoman coin carrying a date equivalent to 1687. Now the soil becomes the problem, because the layer is supposed to be 14th or 15th century, but 1687 is later. 200 years later, maybe 3, depending on where in that medieval band you place the context. You are no longer looking at a far-traveled object in a surprising place. You are looking at time knocked out of alignment. A Roman coin can already be old when it arrives. A 1687 Ottoman coin cannot be older than itself. The room is forced back to the same few possibilities. The layer was disturbed, the object entered later, the context was misread, or someone put it there on purpose. That last possibility has its own shape in Okinawa. Valuable objects were sometimes deposited ritually, placed rather than lost, offered rather than spent. A coin in the ground is not always evidence of trade. Sometimes it is evidence of intent, a pacifying act. A burial of value. Something done because a place needed to be marked, calmed, claimed. If that happened here, then the trench was never simply storing time. It was recording an act in earth, and centuries later that act survives only in fragments. September 26, 2016. Aruma City makes the discovery public. By then, the castle has been a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 2000. The walls are famous. Amawari is famous. The broad story is stable. But inside the paperwork of one excavation, in a 1-meter layer under a fortress that should have behaved itself historically, sit 10 copper coins that refuse to line up. 4 Roman, 1 Ottoman dated 1687, 5 still uncertain at the time. Outside expert Makiko Tsumura says the size, the weight, the photographs, and the X-ray details fit known Roman and Ottoman examples. Archaeologist Hiroki Miyagi does not call it proof of Romans in Japan. He calls it a root problem. So the scene stays where it began. A worker scraping dark soil in December 2013. 10 discs lifted from a medieval castle floor. X-rays pulling empires out of corrosion. A trench dated to the 14th or 15th century. 1 coin that should not be in Okinawa. Another that should not even be in that layer. The strangest coin at Katsuren was not Roman. It was dated 1687. Number 11. The Maine Penny. On August 18, 1957, Guy Melgren was working at Naskeag Point on Blue Hill Bay, along the coast of Brooklyn, Maine, when he reported finding a small silver coin at the Goddard site. He was not a celebrity archaeologist. He was an amateur excavator and a coin collector. That combination can sharpen a discovery or make people doubt it at once. The site was a Native American coastal trading place, active in the late 12th to early 13th century, so the location mattered from the start. This was not a random field. It was a place where objects arrived from elsewhere. In Melgren's hand sat a battered little disc that had come from very far away. At first, it did not look like a world-shaking find. It looked mislabeled. The coin was taken for a medieval English penny. In 1978, it was still being described as a coin of King Stephen. That would have placed it in 12th century England and made the find odd, but not uniquely explosive. Strange objects become footnotes all the time when the label on them feels just plausible enough to stop anyone from looking twice. This one did get looked at again. That changed everything. A London coin dealer, Peter Seeby, and a Norwegian numismatist, Kolbjorn Skara, re-identified it. It was not English. It was Norwegian. Not a 12th century English coin, but an 11th century penny from the reign of Olaf Kyrre, Olaf the Peaceful, who ruled from 1067 to 1093. That sounds like a minor correction. It was not. More than 95% of recorded coins from Olaf Kyrre's reign have been found in Norway. His pennies are thin, crude, and modestly struck, with about 33% silver in this class. You do not expect one to turn up on the coast of Maine, inside an indigenous trading site used centuries before Columbus entered the Atlantic story. Picture the find from Mellgren's side. For years, the object he reported sat in one category. Then specialists moved it into another. The second category was volatile. A genuine Norse coin in Maine does not remain a coin for long. It becomes a headline. It becomes an argument. It becomes the kind of object people want too much. February 1979 matters here. From February 6th through the 8th, Kolbjorn Skåra traveled to the Maine State Museum and examined the piece himself. He judged it genuine, not a reproduction, not a fantasy token, not a modern trick, genuine. If the coin had been fake, the case would have collapsed into a simple fraud story. Authenticity made it harder. The issue was no longer whether the object was old. The issue was how an authentic Norwegian penny of Olaf Kyrre ended up in a Native American site with no other Norse artifacts around it. That absence drives the whole case. No Norse tools, no Norse nails, no Norse fittings, no second Scandinavian coin to make the first one less isolated. Later excavation at Goddard did not produce a matching cache or a stray cluster of Viking debris. What it did strengthen was the picture of the site as a broad trade hub. That may sound less dramatic. It is more interesting. A Norse coin does not require Vikings marching into Maine. It requires movement, exchange, objects passing out of the hands that made them and moving onward. One coast, one river, one alliance at a time. The penny itself looks made for that kind of journey. It is heavily worn. It has a puncture. Those details matter. They suggest it may not have been circulating as money by the time it reached northeastern North American trade networks. It may have been jewelry, a pendant, an amulet, something valued less for face value than for silver, shine, foreignness, or story. That makes the path stranger and more believable at once. A coin minted in Norway in the late 11th century could have crossed to Norse settlements in Greenland or Newfoundland, then moved again through northern indigenous exchange routes, then traveled south and east until it reached coastal Maine, where Mellgren eventually lifted it from the soil. Not direct contact in the cinematic sense, not a Viking stepping onto that exact beach and dropping spare change, a chain, a relay. Knowledge and objects moving farther than the people who first held them. Mellgren's name remains inside the controversy because these cases live or die on context. The coin is accepted as genuine. The archaeological context is the unresolved problem. Was it really deposited during the medieval life of the Goddard site, or was it planted by someone connected to the excavation? That possibility never fully disappears, especially because Mellgren was both the finder and a coin enthusiast. In a case like this, expertise works in two directions. The man most likely to recognize a remarkable coin also becomes the man others most want to doubt. Still, if someone in the 1950s wanted to fake Vikings in America, this was an oddly intelligent way to be stupid. And Olaf Kyrre penny was not the obvious choice. Leif Erikson's voyages sit earlier, so a faker aiming for maximum drama would likely have chosen earlier German or Anglo-Saxon material, the kind that fits popular imagination better and was easier to obtain. Instead, this coin belonged to a king who ruled from 1067 to 1093, and even among known hoards, the details are awkwardly specific. In the Gressley hoard, for example, 104 Class N coins are recorded, 41 were sold publicly, and none matches the main coin exactly. That does not prove innocence. It just makes the forgery route less tidy than people want it to be. So Mellgren's little find sits in an uncomfortable middle ground. The object is solid. The story around it is porous. That is where the best out-of-place artifacts often live. Not because they prove a lost empire touched every shore, but because they expose how fragile chains of custody really are. One coin, one finder, one coastal site used as a trade center. The rest is missing. Mellgren found a coin. Scholars renamed it. Skeptics shadowed it. The sober explanation never became less strange. The Maine Penny does not say the Vikings settled Maine. It says a Norwegian object may have entered indigenous networks so effectively that the only surviving witness is a single pierced disc, detached from the people who moved it and from the knowledge that once explained it. In the record, that kind of loss is almost total. Genuine. Number 10. Kensington Runestone. In 1898, Olaf Oman was clearing trees on his farm near Kensington in Douglas County, Minnesota, when his shovel hit something buried under the roots. He was a Swedish immigrant farmer, working a field about 15 miles southwest of Alexandria. He was pulling stumps, cutting through roots, doing the kind of brutal practical labor that leaves very little room for medieval surprises. But beneath an aspen, some accounts say poplar, lay a slab of gray stone about 79 centimeters tall, 41 wide, 14 thick, weighing around 230 pounds. Across its face were runes, not random scratches, a message dated 1362. The inscription said 8 Swedes and 22 Norwegians had traveled west from Vinland on an expedition. They went fishing, returned, and found 10 of their companions dead, red with blood and dead. Then the survivors set up the stone. Inland Minnesota, 14th century, hundreds of miles from the Atlantic. If that were real, it would tear through the accepted map of Norse exploration in North America, because the only securely known Viking site on the continent is L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, not Minnesota, not even close. The Kensington Runestone spread fast because it was built for attention. A heavy stone, a dramatic inscription, a date old enough to matter, a place wrong enough to electrify people. In the early 1900s, it found its champion in Hjalmar Holand, a Norwegian-American writer who pushed it from local curiosity into a national argument. Holand did not simply present the stone, he campaigned for it. He turned it into a cause. The trouble started almost at once. The moment the focus shifts from the story to the object, the romance thins out. Start with the language, the wording, the shapes of the letters. Runic scholars did not need radar or satellite scans for this. They needed grammar, spelling, and letter forms. The inscription contains forms that look wrong for the 14th century and very familiar to the 19th. Not vaguely modern, specifically modern. Similar rune alphabets appear in Swedish documents dated 1883 and 1885. That is 521 years after the date cut into the stone. So the issue is not just that the runes seem recent. Parts of the alphabet appear to belong to a documented late 19th century rune tradition. One clue is especially damaging. A similar system appears on a Swedish measuring stick tied to the old Stockholm alm, a unit abolished in 1889. That pulls the script into a world of recent farmers, clerks, and rural mnemonic traditions, not medieval explorers cutting memorials into stone on the edge of an unknown continent. If a 1362 inscription uses rune forms linked to a measurement culture still alive in the 1880s, the date on the front stops working as evidence. It starts looking staged. Then there is the text itself. The expedition is described as 8 Swedes and 22 Norwegians, a strangely neat national split for a stone recording a crisis. They travel from Vinland, go inland, go fishing, return, find 10 men dead, and leave a memorial. It reads less like a broken fragment from a medieval frontier and more like a complete tragic scene, ready-made for discovery. Not impossible, but very easy to read, very neatly shaped. The stone also had one advantage that many bad hoaxes do not: weight. Literally. A 104-kilogram slab is not a trinket tucked into a cabinet. It feels serious. It feels costly to fake. You can see why people wanted it to be true. A farmer uncovers a Viking message under a tree root in Minnesota. America gets a deeper Norse past. Scandinavian immigrants get a heroic ancestral claim carved into Midwestern soil. The object does more than sit in a case. It feeds identity. By 1958, the Kensington Runestone had enough power behind it that a museum opened with this single object as its only artifact. One stone. One whole museum. Its influence spread beyond that building. The Runestone Museum itself notes that the fame of the Kensington story fed the imagery that helped shape the Minnesota Vikings' name. So even if the inscription failed as archaeology, it succeeded brilliantly as culture. It gave a region a past it could use. Archaeology is where the case tightens. Today, the Minnesota office of the state archaeologist is blunt. There is no archaeological evidence for a medieval Norse presence in Minnesota. None. No settlement debris, no tools in secure context, no ship remains dragged through the river systems, no camp layers, no associated graves, no chain of finds that turns one carved stone into signs of people actually living there. That absence matters more here than in most cases, because the inscription is not making a tiny claim. It says an inland expedition included 30 people. 30, not one lost traveler. A party that large should leave noise in the record. The record stays silent. So the case falls back onto the stone itself. Scholars study the weathering. Supporters point to age and surface wear. Critics answer that stone can weather after carving, and weathering is a dangerous witness when the inscription's letter forms are already pointing to the 1880s. Once the argument shrinks to geology alone, it becomes easy to miss the stronger forensic question. Not whether the slab is old, but whether the writing system belongs to the year carved on its face. On that point, most professional runic scholars have settled firmly. Late 19th century, not medieval, not Vinland-era testimony. A creation from the same world that discovered it. That leaves the human problem, and the tidy explanation starts to fray. Forgery sounds precise until you try to put the chisel into a real hand. Did Olof Oman carve it himself? Help hide it? Find a prank planted by someone else? Inherit a joke that ran out of control? Or uncover an object already loaded with local ambition before anyone grasped what it could become? The evidence points away from 1362. It does not identify the carver with certainty. That missing name is exactly why the story keeps breathing. You can feel the split. On one side, a medieval expedition in the wrong place. On the other, a 19th century artifact arriving at the exact moment immigrant America was hungry for roots older than its paperwork. If the most important knowledge here is the knowledge of who actually made it, that knowledge disappeared almost immediately. That disappearance may be the most convincing detail in the whole affair. So, the Kensington Runestone is not the smoking gun people wanted. It is a staged scene, with the fingerprints wiped away, a slab with a date, a script with the wrong relatives, a story strong enough to build a museum, but too weak to build a past. Somewhere between the stump Olof Oman pulled in 1898 and the rune alphabets documented in 1883 and 1885, someone understood exactly how to make Minnesota look older than it was. The stone comes up from the roots, the letters catch the light, the evidence never catches up. Number 9. Tecaxic-Calixtlahuaca Head. The head that is only a few inches tall, and almost everything depends on 3 floors. In 1933, Mexican archaeologist José García Payón was excavating at Tecaxic-Calixtlahuaca, a post-classic site in the Toluca Valley, nearly 40 miles northwest of Mexico City. The setting matters: a pyramidal structure, a burial offering below it, 3 intact floors above the deposit. For archaeologists, that kind of context is gold. Sealed layers are supposed to keep later objects out. The inventory sounded straightforward: gold, copper, turquoise, rock crystal, jet, bone, shell, pottery, a late offering from central Mexico, dated to about 1476 to 1510 AD, in the final decades before sustained Spanish control in the region. But among those objects sat one terracotta head, small, bearded, curled hair. The face looked less like late post-classic Mesoamerica and more like something from the Mediterranean world. Start with the date problem. If the burial really closed between 1476 and 1510, then the head was already old when it went in, not by a generation, by well over 1,000 years, if the Roman identification is right. That is the sharper anomaly. Not just a Roman object in Mexico, a much earlier object inside a much later burial. Strange, but not impossible. Mesoamerican offerings do sometimes include curated heirlooms, older things brought forward and placed into newer ritual contexts. The mechanism exists. The numbers do not kill the story. They change it. Now the object itself. García Payón did not turn it into a sensation in 1933. He published only a short note in 1961. 28 years after the excavation. That delay is one reason the case still breathes. The same year, the art historian Robert Heine Geldern looked at the head and judged it Roman-looking. Later classical specialists went narrower. They linked the beard and hair to the Severan period, roughly the 2nd to 3rd century AD. Line up the chronology and the gap sharpens fast. A style pointing to around 200 AD, placed into a burial dated roughly 1476 to 1510. Not a mismatch of decades, something like 1,300 years. But style is not chemistry. Hair and beards can suggest a period. They cannot lock one. So, move to the lab. In 1995, the head was tested by thermoluminescence at Heidelberg's archaeometry unit. The test measures the accumulated radiation dose in fired clay and estimates when it was last heated to a high temperature. In plain terms, if someone made the object recently and tried to pass it off as ancient, TL should have a chance to expose that. The result usually gets quoted in two different ways, and the difference matters. One published framing gave an age of 1780, plus or minus 400 years before present. Run that range out, and you land nowhere near a modern forgery. Critics later argued that the safer interpretation was broader, about 870 BC to 1270 AD. That wider span is less exciting, but still useful. It pushes the clay comfortably before 1933. It also makes a fresh colonial or modern workshop fake unlikely. So the lab does one important job. It weakens the easy explanation. Not impossible in some abstract sense, but weaker. A tourist trinket planted in the 20th century should not come back with an ancient firing date. A casual hoax gets harder to stage once the clay itself looks old. The TL numbers do not prove Rome. They do not even prove the head belonged in that burial. They prove something narrower. The terracotta was fired long before Garcia Payón's excavation. That is all. Ancient clay can still be intrusive clay. An old object can still arrive in the wrong box, the wrong trench, or the wrong story. Here the case stops being about style and starts being about chain of custody. You are in 1933. No digital photography. No high-resolution trench log uploaded the same day. No in situ image of the head lying among the rest of the offering under those 3 intact floors. What survives does not meet modern excavation standards. The whole claim narrows to one vulnerable point. Do you trust the recovery record? That weakness sounds small until you put numbers on it. 3 floors above the burial sound airtight, but only if the object was actually documented inside that sealed deposit at the moment of discovery. The offering date of 1476 to 1510 sounds decisive, but only if the head truly belonged to that offering. The TL range of 870 BC to 1270 AD sounds devastating for a modern fake, but only if the head was not introduced into the collection later. Every strong number in this story depends on one unphotographed event in 1933. Then the explanations start multiplying. One possibility is genuine pre-Columbian arrival by some transoceanic route. That is the version people jump to first because it is the loudest. But it demands a long chain of events beyond the object itself. Transport across an ocean, survival, movement inland, preservation for centuries, then final deposition in a late burial in central Mexico. Another possibility is quieter and far less cinematic. Early colonial intrusion. After 1519, Roman objects, or objects mistaken for Roman, could in theory circulate through Spanish hands into New Spain. But the burial date presses against that idea, because 1476 to 1510 sits mostly before that world takes hold in the Toluca Valley. So the mundane explanations gain force. A cataloging error, an accidental mixing of materials after excavation, a prank, not a globe-spanning conspiracy. One small object enters one local collection at the wrong moment, then inherits the authority of everything around it. The head does not need an empire to travel into that burial on paper. It needs one break in procedure. That matters because this is exactly how knowledge vanishes. Not always in fire, not always in conquest. Sometimes in a gap of 28 years between discovery and publication. Sometimes in the missing photograph you wish existed. Sometimes in the confidence produced by a sealed context that was never sealed for the camera. When the chain is thin, the object starts speaking louder than the record. That is when people with theories rush in. Look at the arithmetic one last time. Found in 1933, published briefly in 1961, Roman-style assessment the same year. Severin parallels around the 2nd to 3rd century AD. Burial dated to 1476 to 1510. TL tested in 1995. Ancient firing date, yes. Roman identity, unproven. Secure burial context, unverified by modern standards. The case is built from real numbers, but every number leans on the weakest one of all. One documented find spot with no surviving in situ proof. Officially, the Tecaxic-Calixtlahuaca Head is the famous Roman-looking artifact from pre-Columbian Mexico. On the numbers alone, it is something narrower and more dangerous. An ancient terracotta head with a late burial date attached to it by trust, not proof. And the record stops there. Number 8. Nampa Figurine. In 1890, years after the little figure was lifted from an Idaho well, geologist George Frederick Wright stopped treating it like a curiosity. He treated it like a crime scene. Letters sat on his desk from Mark A. Kurtz, from G.M. Cumming, from men trying to pin down times, depths, pipe sizes, soil layers, and who had seen what. The scramble says a lot. Even then, the figurine itself was not the main problem. The problem was the claim attached to it. If a baked clay human image really came up from 320 feet below Nampa, beneath about 60 feet of soil, beneath 12 to 15 feet of lava rock, beneath alternating quicksand and clay, then the timeline did not just bend. It snapped at one precise point. Human hands would have shaped fired clay in deposits many geologists of the time tied to the ancient lake beds of the Snake River Valley, deposits early mapping placed in the Pliocene. In plain English, not old by a few centuries, not misplaced by a single burial, but impossibly old. Old enough to pull human craft back into a world far earlier than scholars were prepared to accept. Once that possibility appeared, every detail of the recovery mattered more than the object itself. Go back to late summer, 1889, to the new railroad town of Nampa, Idaho. The town sat at about 2,490 feet above sea level, but the argument played out underground. Mark A. Kurtz, a businessman helping oversee an artesian well, had spent days handling the discharge from a sand pump. He was not glancing at it. He was running the coarse material through his fingers as it came up from the bore. Sometime between 11 and noon, he noticed something easy to miss, thin enough at first glance to look like a twig. He rinsed it in a barrel. Then the shape emerged, a tiny human figure, about 1.5 inches long, made of baked clay. That moment carries the whole case, not because it proves anything, but because it is so ordinary. No museum, no ceremonial excavation, no trench grid. Just wet grit, a barrel of water, a man at a well, and an object that should not have been there. Kurtz understood the objection at once. Everybody did. Somebody dropped it, somebody planted it, or the pump pulled down recent material from above. So he leaned on mechanics. The well used heavy 6-inch tubing. The figurine, he argued, could not simply slip intact from the surface, survive the violence of the process, and emerge looking the way it did. Others supported parts of the story. Charles Francis Adams, president of the Union Pacific Railroad, passed the report to Wright. Wright gathered testimony and published the correspondence in 1890, because delay would only weaken the chain. But the chain was already weakest where it mattered most. Nobody excavated the figurine in controlled archaeological context. Nobody photographed it in situ, because there was no in situ to photograph. There was only a claim about where the pumped material came from, and a reconstruction afterward by responsible people trying to fix in place an event that lasted seconds. The numbers cut both ways. 320 feet sounds devastating. So do the layers above it, 60 feet of soil, then a cap of basaltic lava, then quicksand and clay beds below. To a believer, that sequence seals the figurine away from the modern world. To a skeptic, it only describes the geology the drill passed through, not the secure age of one small object caught in the drilling system. The well may expose old lake bed-like sediments. The object still needs a trustworthy path into the sample stream. The paper trail is the strangest part. Wright was not chasing a folktale decades later. He was dealing with near-immediate damage control. letters, recollections, statements, an effort to prove honesty by multiplying witnesses. But honesty is not the same as context. A witness can truthfully say, "I saw it come out of the pump discharge," and still be unable to say how it entered the drill zone. Modern skeptical readings press exactly there. Maybe it was a recent object moved downward by fissures in disturbed ground, maybe by local disruption in the sediments, maybe by the mechanics of drilling itself, maybe by contamination at the well. The options differ, but their structure stays the same. The depth belongs to the bore, not securely to the figurine. There is another problem, smaller but lethal. The figurine's reddish staining was treated by some as a badge of age, as if mineral color proved long burial. Wright included an appendix showing that similar coloration could be produced quickly with hydrochloric acid and reheating. That does not prove fraud, but it strips away one of the easiest arguments to trust. The object could look old without being unimaginably old. After that, the case rests almost entirely on testimony around the pump. Imagine Kurtz was right. Imagine the depth was right. Imagine the object truly belonged to those ancient beds. Then the consequence is concrete. A human figure fired in clay lay under a basalt-capped sequence and waited for an industrial well to yank it back into daylight in 1889. One railroad town in Idaho would have drilled into a human past nobody had mapped. Not lost for centuries, lost for geological ages. But the surviving record cannot carry that weight safely. It carries something messier and more revealing, a frontier-age artifact, a sensational depth claim, respectable men trying to secure a story before it unraveled. Geology doing what geology always does in these cases, describing the sediments beautifully while refusing to authenticate the one moment that matters. The Nampa figurine became famous as an object in the wrong place. Its sharper lesson is narrower. It shows how quickly authority gathers around a dramatic depth, and how little that depth means when the chain of custody depends on memory instead of excavation. Officially, the Nampa image is the tiny clay figure said to have come from 320 feet beneath Idaho. On the evidence we actually have, it is a recent-looking human figurine tied to an ancient depth by a drilling story no later investigator can reopen. Somewhere between the well pipe, the sand pump, and the barrel of rinse water, the object either carried impossible history into the modern world or disappeared into the one place no one could search again, the hole itself. Number 7. Lake Winnipesaukee Mystery Stone. In 1872, in Meredith, New Hampshire, men digging post holes near Lake Winnipesaukee struck a lump of clay and brought it to Seneca A. Ladd. Ladd was a banker, a collector, and the sort of 19th century local notable who kept curiosities close at hand. When the clay was opened, it revealed a dark stone just under 4 inches tall, about 2.5 inches wide, weighing roughly 1.2 pounds, small enough to fit in one hand, strange enough to take over a room. This thing did not look accidental. It was polished, egg-shaped, carved on multiple sides with images that felt deliberate and maddeningly disconnected. A human face, an ear of corn, a shape often described as a teepee, arrows, rows of dots, a crescent, a spiral. One object, too many signals. Native American relic, some said. Treaty stone, maybe. Ceremonial marker. Memorial. Hoax. Nobody could make the pictures settle into one story. That only made the stone more useful as a story of its own. Ladd did something crucial with it. He did not lock it into an excavation file. He put it in a glass case in his bank lobby. That choice changed the evidence. The moment an object becomes a public curiosity, before it becomes a documented find, the trail starts drifting away from the artifact and into testimony. People no longer remember a trench, a layer, a measured depth, a precise location. They remember seeing the thing. They remember hearing where it came from. They remember that respectable men believed it. The Lake Winnipesaukee Mystery Stone entered the historical record the way many troubling objects do, not through controlled archaeology, but through display. By November 1872, the American naturalist was already treating it as a remarkable relic, not a joke, not a casual oddity, a relic, possibly native, possibly tied to some formal event like a treaty. That sounds impressive until you look at what the document actually gives you. It proves the stone existed in 1872. It proves educated people took it seriously very early. It proves Ladd had something unusual enough to circulate into print within months. What it does not prove is the one thing a case like this needs most: the discovery context in forensic detail. No measured coordinates, no excavator's field notes, no stratigraphy, no secure layer. Just a local find near the shore, a collector, and a printed description that hardens rumor into provenance. Picture the scene. You are standing in a New Hampshire bank in the 1870s. Behind the glass sits this glossy black egg with its impossible little face staring back at you. It looks old. It looks important. It looks like it came from somewhere else. But the glass case is doing two opposite things at once. It preserves the object. It destroys the scene. After Ladd died in 1892, the stone passed to his daughter, Frances Ladd Coe. In 1927, she donated it to the New Hampshire Historical Society, which is why the object survives at all. That donation created a second document trail, cleaner than the first. We know whose collection it came from. We know when it entered an institution. We know it remained famous enough to keep being discussed. But a careful institutional home cannot repair a broken birth certificate. If the first hours of a discovery are vague, the next 50 years of respectable custody preserve that vagueness more elegantly. Then, the stone itself started causing trouble. The material is generally described as quartzite, with some discussion of myelinite by later observers. Either way, it is not the kind of stone most people expected for a neat local New Hampshire relic. No close parallel was known in the United States. The iconography did not line up cleanly. The workmanship looked oddly crisp in some places and oddly generic in others. This was not like finding a pot in the wrong layer. It was worse. It was an object that seemed to speak in symbols, but in no fully recognizable language. Up to this point, the mystery is interpretive. What do the carvings mean? Who made them? Why is there no good comparison? Then in 1994, investigators looked at something much less romantic than the face or the spiral. They looked down the hole. A borescope inspection examined the straight perforation running through the stone. That bore appears to have been drilled from both ends, and secondary summaries describe the two openings as different in size, roughly 1/8 of an inch at one end and 3/8 at the other. That alone is interesting. But state archaeologist Richard Boisvert focused on the regularity. The interior looked extremely even, extremely controlled, consistent not with ancient hand drilling, but with 19th or 20th century metal tools, possibly power tools. If the bore is modern, then the object in your hand is not simply an undocumented relic. It is an altered object, maybe a fabrication, maybe a composite, maybe an older carved stone that was later drilled for mounting or display. The hole does not just add a detail, it attacks the object's identity from the inside. Because the hole looks mechanical, attention swings back to the person at the center of the chain, Seneca Ladd. Not because there is proof he faked it, there is not, but he is the first secure human being attached to the stone, and the stone reached the public through his collection, in his bank, under his care. That is the ugly arithmetic of provenance. The less you know about where an object came from, the more weight falls on the first person who can be named. Boisvert made the sharpest point in the whole affair, and it was not about the carvings at all. Archaeological context can matter more than the object itself. The missing piece is not symbolic meaning. It is scene control, exact find spot, exact layer, exact conditions. Without that, the stone can be admired, measured, photographed, even tool-tested, but it cannot be securely placed back into history. After that, every theory floats. This little object belongs in a story about vanished knowledge for a simple reason. It shows how fast knowledge can be replaced by narrative. A find becomes a display becomes a newspaper item becomes a relic. The hard part, the disciplined part, the part that takes generations to build in archaeology, never even gets a chance to begin. So what is the Lake Winnipesaukee Mystery Stone? A genuine ancient object from an unknown tradition. a 19th century invention cut to look archaic, or the most frustrating version, an older stone later drilled, mounted, and pushed across the line where evidence stops and performance begins. The face, the corn, the dots, the crescent, all of that draws your eye. But the straight hole is colder than the carvings, and more decisive. It may be the one honest thing the stone ever said. Modern hands touched me. Number 6. Quimbaya Gold Artifacts. You're in the hills near Finlandia, Colombia, around 1890. The ground is cut open. Tomb after tomb. Men pull metal out of the dark by hand. Not one showpiece. Hundreds. Gold and gold-copper objects come up in clusters. Seated figures, pins, pendants, body ornaments, lime containers. Small things. Dense things. Things made by people who knew exactly what they were doing. The problem is not that the objects look fake. It's the opposite. They look too good, too coherent, too skilled. Colombia's Ministry of Cultures reports 433 objects from the rural Finlandia area. That is not random treasure. It is a metalworking tradition surfacing all at once, then losing the one thing archaeology cannot rebuild after the fact: context. You know this pattern by now. The object survives, the knowledge around it dies first. Exact tomb, exact layer, exact arrangement. Gone. Looters do not excavate scenes, they break them. So from the first moment these pieces enter public life, they carry two different weights. One is what they are. The other is what can no longer be proved about them. Even with that damage, people could see what they had. This was not crude bullion, not scrap, not melted wealth waiting to become coin. These were worked forms with style, proportion, casting skill, and a very clear visual language. Birds, humans, animal bodies folded into ornament, wearable things built to mean something before they were ever built to dazzle. That matters because the internet version of this story starts with the shape. Aviation people point at a few small pendants and say, "Look at the wings, look at the tail, look at the fuselage." But the first people who mattered here were not looking at futuristic machines. They were looking at evidence of an indigenous tradition sophisticated enough to embarrass anyone still clinging to the old colonial fantasy that complex technology only arrives from somewhere else. The gold becomes famous almost immediately, and fame pulls in curators, collectors, officials, and diplomats. The objects do what so many vulnerable artifacts do in the modern world. They leave home. In 1892, part of the material was sent to Spain for the events marking the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the Americas. Stop there for a second. Pre-Hispanic gold, taken from tombs in Colombia, crosses the Atlantic to help stage a commemoration of the man whose arrival began the conquest that shattered so much of the world, that made such objects possible in the first place. At that point, the artifact is doing more than sitting in a case. It is being used. Then comes the sharper move. In May 1893, President Carlos Holguín gave 122 pieces to Queen Regent Maria Cristina. The gesture was framed as thanks for Spain's arbitration in the Colombia-Venezuela border dispute. Now, the core disputed collection is not just art, it is diplomacy in metal. 122 objects, small enough to fit in cases, heavy enough to pull two nations into an argument more than a century later. Here, the wrong place idea splits into two different stories, and people keep crushing them together online. The first story is legal. Why are these objects in Madrid? Spain's position is simple. They were transferred in 1893 as a state gift, so the collection in the Museum of America is there legitimately. Colombia's counterargument is just as sharp. A gift of national heritage, made without congressional authorization, cannot become lawful just because it was wrapped in diplomatic gratitude. The unresolved contradiction is not whether the objects exist, it is whether a political handover under those conditions can justify permanent loss. The second story is pseudo-archaeology. This is the airplane story. At some point, images of small Colombian gold pendants began circulating online under labels like ancient airplanes. Once that label sticks, people stop reading museum records and start reading silhouettes. They see a nose, wings, a vertical tail. Done. Case closed. Lost aviation. Forgotten high technology. Maybe aliens, if the evening is going badly. But look closer, not with fantasy, with catalog data. The Metropolitan Museum of Art has a Tolima winged gold pendant dated to the 1st to 7th century. It is 17.8 by 11.1 by 1 centimeters. Not a machine blueprint, a pendant, wearable, symbolic. The museum explicitly frames comparable pieces through animal imagery and shamanic costume. Another object, an early Quimbaya Bird pendant dated 300 BCE to 700 CE, is just 4.4 by 1.9 by 5.7 centimeters. Tiny, cast in gold alloy, and the details that matter most are painfully unromantic. Suspension loops, sprue remains, the marks of how the piece was cast and worn. Those are craft clues. They tell you how the object was made and used on a body. They do not point to aerodynamics. They point to metallurgy. You can feel the swap happen. It is the same swap that keeps happening. Hard-won knowledge that took generations to build. In this case, knowledge of alloy, casting, iconography, ritual use, regional style, gets flattened into one viral claim because the claim is easier to sell. Why learn a metalworking tradition when you can post an airplane? Why deal with looted tombs, broken provenance, and colonial transfer when you can crop the photo and call it proof of lost flight? When knowledge vanishes, the makers do not benefit. The descendants do not benefit. The objects do not benefit. The winners are the people who inherit mystery at a discount and turn it into spectacle. The timing makes it worse. A century after the 1893 transfer, the collection became a repatriation case. In 2017, Colombia's Constitutional Court ordered the government to pursue its return. On May 9, 2024, Colombia sent a formal request to Spain, demanding the collection back. By December 14, 2024, Spain still had not formally answered. While the internet argues over imaginary aircraft, the actual fight sits in plain view. Who owns the evidence of a culture once it has been looted, exhibited, gifted, and normalized abroad? You start in a grave in rural Colombia. You end in a museum in Madrid. Somewhere in between, birds become planes, heritage becomes diplomacy, and craftsmanship becomes conspiracy. So, are the so-called Quimbaya airplanes objects in the wrong place? Yes, but not for the reason the myth wants. The dislocation is not technological, it is historical. The pendants were pushed out of their tombs, out of their cultural system, out of Colombia, and then out of their meaning. The strangest thing about them is not that they resemble machines. Strip away the labels, and they point to something more unsettling. A civilization's expertise survived in metal. The chain explaining that expertise was cut almost as soon as the gold touched daylight. The cleanest witness is not a treasure hunter, not a YouTube diagram. It is the museum record itself, pendant in the form of a bird. Number 5. Saqqara Bird. In 1972, at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, Dr. Khalil Masiha stood in front of a display case and read a line that nearly erased the object. Wooden bird. JE33109, SR4/6347. A museum number, a shelf number, a category. Inside the glass sat a carved figure only 18 centimeters across, dated broadly to the Ptolemaic period, between 305 and 300 BCE, often narrowed to around 200 BCE. It had a beak, it had wings, it had a tail that rose straight up like a fin. From the right angle, with the light flattening the wood grain and wiping out the small irregularities, it did not look like a bird at all. Masiha leans closer. You lean with him. The wings are not spread like a falcon in mid-beat. They sit straight, almost level, a flat span from tip to tip. The body is narrow. The tail is vertical, not fanned. No painted feathers survive to force the obvious reading. No caption beside it says toy, cult object, masthead, or offering. Only wooden bird. That label came from an older moment, Victor Lored's excavation at Saqqara in 1899, or 1898 in looser retellings, when the object was lifted from Egypt's funerary landscape and entered a system built to sort it, register it, and move on. Masiha does not move on. He is a physician. He is also a flight enthusiast. That second habit changes the room. A museum case full of animal forms turns into a hangar of shapes. He looks at the wings first, because anyone who has watched aircraft long enough looks at the wings first, then the tail, then the body line from nose to stern. The glass case is still. The room is still. In his head, the object has already left the pedestal. He imagines air striking the front edge. He imagines lift. He imagines people 2,000 years back carving a glider model and placing it in a tomb. Not a symbolic bird, not a child's toy, a machine in miniature. The shift happens without a new discovery. The object stays the same. The sentence attached to it changes. The claim hardens slowly. First a private conviction, then a lecture, then a paper, then a television segment. By the time it reaches a wider audience, much of the uncertainty has been shaved away. The missing context at Saqqara stops being the problem. The story becomes a different one. How did everyone miss the obvious? A wooden figure excavated by Victor Leray and tucked away for decades is recast as proof that ancient Egyptians understood flight long before modern aviation. Once that idea lands, every feature starts to fall into line behind it. The straight wings, the vertical tail, the clean central body. Even the size helps. 18 centimeters feels like a model, something a hand could toss into the air. The date helps more. Around 200 BCE is old enough to feel impossible, yet recent enough to belong to a literate, technically sophisticated civilization. The appeal is easy to feel. A lost design, a vanished experiment, knowledge that slipped out of the record and left only a shape behind. So the bird begins to fly in imagination long before anyone proves it can fly in air. Then the missing part comes into view. The object in the case lacks one feature aircraft do not quietly do without. No confirmed horizontal tailplane, no small stabilizing surface crossing the rear, no fixed element to keep pitch under control. The vertical tail is there, yes. The horizontal part, the thing that keeps a glider from nodding, stalling, and driving its nose into the floor, is not. So the measuring starts. One set of hands measures the body. Another sketches replacements. Another carves replicas. In 2002, Martin Gregori drafts a plan. In May 2011, more replicas are built for television. Wood is shaped, surfaces are smoothed, angles are adjusted. Again and again, the little bird acquires what the original object does not securely possess: a horizontal stabilizer, a more convincing airfoil, better balanced materials, a launch generous enough to help it survive its first seconds. The ancient artifact remains in the museum case. The thing being flown becomes something else. The problem is visible in a workshop before anyone says it aloud. The original sits there with its blunt certainty. The replica sits beside it with quiet improvements. Sand a little here, add a piece there, trim the rear, shift the center of mass. It is an old trick in technological myth-making. Keep the silhouette, change the machine. Now step into the test. You hold the replica at shoulder height. Open space waits ahead. For a second, the claim feels almost solid. Ancient designers, secret aerodynamics, a model carried across millennia in cedar or sycamore or some other surviving wood. You let go. If the story is right, it should settle, catch air, and move forward cleanly. But every serious version of the experiment has to negotiate the same absence. Without added help, the bird does not behave like a clever aircraft trapped inside an ancient form. It behaves like an object with the wrong balance and too little control. It wants to roll. It wants to pitch. It wants to lose speed, lose authority, and stop being a graceful theory. In 2023, that suspicion was turned into numbers. In Acta Mechanica et Automatica, Volume 17, Issue 3, pages 405 to 409, a computational fluid dynamics study based on a 3D scan of the artifact was accepted on April 4th. The authors set the inflow at 10 meters per second and asked the shape to do what the myth has always demanded: glide. The answer was short. From a drop of 2 meters, the maximum range came out to about 5.48 meters. Endurance, about 1.51 seconds. Worse, the model did not settle into stable flight. It rolled, pitched, stalled, and crashed. Back in the museum, none of those equations can be seen. The bird still sits under its label. Room 22 in recent display reports. Small, wooden, intact enough to tempt you, incomplete enough to let your mind finish the design. The exact find spot within the Saqqara or Memphis necropolis remains frustratingly unclear. The popular tomb story does not sit firmly in the registration trail. The original context is thin. Here, that thinness matters more than anywhere else. The less you know about where an object stood, the easier it is to make it stand for something else. So, the case holds two objects at once. One is a Ptolemaic wooden figure from a poorly documented funerary world, registered by excavators who saw a bird and moved on. The other is an aircraft assembled in hindsight, one added stabilizer at a time, until modern desire can recognize itself in ancient wood. A guard passes. The room hums softly. Glass throws the ceiling lights across the wings. You keep staring, and the object starts shifting between categories again. Falcon, toy, vane, offering, boat ornament, machine. Then your eye lands on the tail, the piece that launched the whole fantasy. It stands straight up in the still museum air. The missing part is nowhere there. Number 4. Baghdad Battery, the jar that lost its wires. In 1938, Wilhelm Koenig was working through material tied to the Iraq Museum when 4 small clay vessels from Kujut Rabu caught his eye. They were not grand objects, no gold, no carved king, just unglazed jars from a grave group unearthed in 1936 near Baghdad, in the old Parthian and Sasanian landscape around Ctesiphon. But one of them carried a combination that felt wrong at first glance. A copper cylinder, an iron spike driven through a bitumen plug, all packed inside a ceramic vessel. Koenig had spent his career around antiquities. He knew what ordinary containers looked like. This did not look ordinary. 3 of the 4 vessels held copper cylinders. Only one also preserved the iron spike. Clay outside, copper within, iron at the center, an asphalt-like seal at the top. Arrange those parts in the right way, and the resemblance is hard to ignore. It looks uncomfortably close to a wet cell battery, more than 1,700 years before Alessandro Volta assembled his pile in 1800. In that moment, the object split into 2 identities. Officially, it was a vessel from an ancient burial context. In Koenig's hands, it became a machine. The idea made immediate intuitive sense. Fill a clay jar holding copper and iron with an acidic liquid, vinegar, grape juice, anything sour enough to act as an electrolyte, and you can coax out a small voltage, around 1 volt in simple modern replicas. Not much. You are not lighting a city. You are pulling electricity out of an object tied to a world usually described through kings, caravans, and cavalry, not current. So, the story spread because it fit in a few sharp images. Ancient Iraq, a sealed jar, metal inside metal, the wrong invention in the wrong century. Look closer at Koenig's actual problem, though, and the thing starts slipping. The find was not a workshop cache. It came from a grave group. Reports describe 4 vessels together, and some summaries note flaky, papyrus-like remains inside. That keeps a much duller explanation on the table. Container, deposit, maybe even a holder for scrolls or ritual material. That answer sounds exactly like archaeology. It does not sound like revelation. Still, Koenig's idea held on because the parts kept baiting the modern mind. Copper and iron separated inside a jar are not random. They are the beginning of a circuit, only the beginning. If this was really a battery, where are the conductors? Where are the wires? Where are the repeatable traces of electrolyte inside the original vessel? Where are the securely identified electroplated artifacts from the same context? That last claim mattered most. Koenig suggested the device may have been used for electroplating. The image is irresistible. An ancient craftsperson dipping an object into solution, laying down a fine coat of metal with invisible force. Knowledge hidden in plain sight, then gone. That possibility gave the jar its charge. It suggested not only lost technology, but lost specialists. People who knew how to do something later ages forgot how to recognize. The archaeology does not complete the circuit. The numbers themselves are frustrating. 4 jars, but only 3 copper cylinders. 3 cylinders, but just 1 iron spike. 1 possible cell, but no clear external terminal. The strongest clue is also the strongest objection. If the copper cylinder was sealed inside the jar, how do you actually connect it in practical use? Recent reconstructions try to solve that by imagining a more complex design, even 2 cells in series, capable of over 1.4 volts rather than a single volt. But that is a new hypothesis, not consensus. It shows how badly people want the object to work. It does not prove that it did. Now stand beside Koenig in 1938. A small vessel sits in your hands, from a world dated broadly to the Parthian era, 248 BC to AD 226, though some scholars stretch the context into the Sasanian period that follows. It is humble, hand-sized, quiet, yet it seems to murmur across nearly 2 millennia. You were not the first people to discover this. That murmur carried the Baghdad Battery far beyond academia. It moved into books, documentaries, classrooms, conspiracy theories, and dinner table history. Unlike a lost manuscript or a broken mechanism, this claim can be grasped almost instantly. Jar, metal, acid, voltage. Archaeology is cruel to stories that arrive too neatly packaged. No secure proof of electrolyte residue has settled the matter. No associated wiring system has turned up. No confirmed plated objects from that exact context have closed the case. So the artifact hangs in a maddening middle state, plausible enough to reconstruct, incomplete enough to doubt, famous enough to harden into myth. Then the story turns darker. The man who first turned this jar into a global mystery cannot help us anymore, and neither, in the most direct sense, can the object itself. After the invasion of Iraq in 2003, the Iraq Museum entered the most catastrophic days in its history. Between April 8th and April 12th, looters tore through galleries and storage areas. The estimated losses ran to around 15,000 items. In the chaos that followed, the original Baghdad Battery was widely reported as lost. A wrong place artifact, already controversial, disappeared into the same black hole that has swallowed so much of Iraq's material past. That loss changed the argument in a way people often miss. Before 2003, scholars could at least hope to re-examine the jar directly, test residues, inspect joins, study corrosion, recheck drawings against the physical object. After the looting, the most important witness in the case was gone, not disproven, not confirmed, removed. So Koenig's little vessel survives, for most people, as photographs, descriptions, replicas, and a chain of retellings. The battery can still be rebuilt. It can still be made to produce voltage. It can still look astonishing on camera. But the original archaeological conversation is now missing its center. The larger pattern is hard to miss. Sometimes knowledge disappears because a craft dies out. Sometimes it disappears because the context that explained it was never properly recorded. Sometimes war reaches the museum before science reaches the storage shelf. Officially, the Baghdad Battery remains an unresolved artifact from a burial group, with no definitive proof it ever powered anything. In practice, it became something far more volatile, a lost object used to argue for a lost technology, after the evidence that might have settled the case was itself lost. Number 3. Piri Reis Map, the map that was supposed to know Antarctica. On a spring day between March 9th and April 7th, 1513, in Gallipoli, the Ottoman admiral Piri Reis finished a colored world map on gazelle parchment and dated it Muharram 919 in his own inscription. He was a sailor, a corsair, a compiler, and he was very clear about what he had done. This was not a prophet's vision, not a secret relic from a vanished civilization. He says he took older material and forced it into one scale, about 20 charts, 8 older world map traditions, 1 Arabic map of India, 4 recent Portuguese maps, and 1 Western map linked to Christopher Columbus. 4 years later, in 1517, after the Ottoman conquest of Egypt, he presented that map to Sultan Selim I in Cairo. Then, it disappeared into palace holdings for more than 4 centuries. When it returned as a sensation. but not for the reason the evidence supports. In 1929, scholars cataloging material in the Topkapi Palace Museum Library in Istanbul came across a torn fragment in the Revan collection, catalog number 1633. They found only part of the original sheet, but it was enough. The surviving piece showed the Atlantic, the coasts of Western Europe and Northwest Africa, and the newly encountered lands across the ocean. Paul Kale studied it, wrote about it, and newspapers seized on the headline, a 1513 map that seemed to show things Europeans were not supposed to know yet. Here the legend starts to harden. One old chart, one jagged southern coastline, one modern obsession. From there the claim swells fast. Ancient global surveyors, forgotten high civilizations, even Antarctica mapped before ice. Start with the mechanism, because this object explains itself if you read it. Piri Reis was building a portolan-style working chart. You can see it in the geometry. The surviving fragment carries 2 large 32-point compass roses and 3 smaller ones, while the full original is thought to have contained 17. Those roses are not decoration. They drive the map. Rum lines spread from them like a web, giving navigators directional bearings across the sea. This is not mystical cartography. It is stitched navigation, assembled from practical charts meant to move ships from port to port. If the map feels unnervingly accurate in places, that is not the first mystery. It is what you would expect from a compiler using the best material he could get from multiple traditions. Portuguese pilots had been pushing down the African coast for decades. Columbus had crossed the Atlantic in 1492. Spanish and Portuguese information moved through capture, copying, trade, espionage, and gift exchange. Piri says so himself. He is not hiding his sources. He is bragging about them. Then you get to the famous claim. Look at the lower part of the fragment, the southern landmass that bends eastward in a way modern eyes want to recognize. People point to it and say, Antarctica. Then they go further. Not the Antarctica sailors actually encountered in the 19th century, but an ice-free Antarctica, as if someone had surveyed the coastline in deep prehistory and passed the data down through lost civilizations until it landed on an Ottoman desk in 1513. It is a perfect pseudo-mystery, a real artifact, damaged edges, missing context, just enough ambiguity for imagination to take over. Now, the dry part. The Antarctica reading works only if you treat a distorted, incomplete, early 16th century coastline like a precise modern projection. But this is a composite chart. It compresses incompatible source maps into one frame, different scales, different coastlines, different assumptions. That creates stretching, doubling, misplacement, and drift. It is the cartographic equivalent of forcing pieces from several puzzles into one box and feeling impressed that some edges still meet. Gregory C. McIntosh spent 230 pages in his 2000 study dismantling this claim in detail. His conclusion is blunt. The southern land is not proof of prehistoric Antarctic mapping. It fits much better with a familiar early modern habit, Terra Australis, the hypothetical southern continent cartographers kept drawing because symmetry felt persuasive long before evidence did. The real historical shock sits somewhere else, not at the bottom of the map, in the Atlantic, in the Caribbean. Piri's inscription says one of his western sources came from Columbus, maybe an actual Columbus chart, maybe a copy, maybe an intermediary made from Columbus-derived material. Scholars disagree on the exact chain. Kale connected it to a lost Columbus map of 1498. McIntosh argues the preserved geography fits Columbus's second voyage, between 1493 and 1496, better than a later version. Either way, the important point is colder and stranger than the myth. A piece of Columbus geography that does not survive in a Columbus original may survive here, refracted through Ottoman hands. That unevenness in the details starts to make sense. Some islands sit recognizably in the Columbus orbit. Some coasts are misshapen. South America appears, but not as a finished modern continent. This is not impossible knowledge arriving too early. It is new knowledge arriving messy, partial, and fast. The map is a traffic jam of first contact data. Portuguese coastal charts, Arabic geographic inheritance, older world map conventions, Western reports from the Atlantic, all of it compressed in Gallipoli in 1513 by a man who understood that information had become a weapon. Read it that way, and even the errors start speaking. A forged supermap would try to look omniscient. This one does not. It looks patched. It looks negotiated. It looks like a navigator trying to make unlike sources coexist on one skin. Historians take it seriously for exactly that reason. UNESCO does not preserve it because it proves Antarctica was known in antiquity. It preserves it because it captures a moment when geographic knowledge from rival powers collided on a single sheet. There is another reason the myth survives. The map is incomplete. We do not have the full original. We have a torn fragment. Torn objects invite fantasy because the missing edge can always be made to hide anything. A lost coast, a lost survey, a lost civilization. Missing paper usually does something less glamorous. It amplifies whatever story the loudest reader wants to tell. So the Piri Reis Map is not a map in the wrong place. It is a map from the right place, read the wrong way. An Ottoman admiral in 1513 gathered about 20 charts and several mapping traditions, built a navigational image with compass rose logic, and preserved traces of Atlantic discoveries still in motion. The sensational claim points south toward an imaginary ice-free continent. The evidence points west, toward a vanished Columbus tradition no longer extant in its own name. The wrong place object turns out to be a wrong place headline. The last image is quieter than the legend. A torn fragment in a palace library, collection number 1633, survives because it was forgotten well enough to stay alive. Not a message from a prehistoric master civilization, a salvage of working knowledge, copied from hand to hand until the original hands disappeared. The coastline that matters most on this map may belong to a document that is already gone. Number 2. Nebra Sky Disc. In February 2002, in a room at the Hilton Hotel in Basel, state archaeologist Harold Meller waited for two men carrying an object that should never have been there. Not in a Swiss hotel, not in a police sting, not after 3 years on the black market. When the sellers opened the case, they revealed a greenish bronze disc about 32 centimeters across, patched with gold. A crescent, a round plate, 32 stars. But the disc did not arrive alone. Its trail ran back to a hill near Nebra in Saxony-Anhalt, and to a damaged hoard that had already lost the one thing archaeology cannot replace: context. A misplaced object is one problem. A stolen object with its past torn out of the ground is another. Start with the numbers. 32 centimeters in diameter, about 3,600 years old by the dominant reconstruction. 32 gold stars in its earliest image phase, plus one crescent moon and one round form read as the sun or full moon. 5 phases of modification: 2 swords, 2 axes, 2 arm spirals, 1 chisel. The find spot, Middelburg Hill. The burial date usually given, around 1600 BC. The recovery date, February 2002. UNESCO registration, June 2013. And under all of it sits one ugly number: 3 years. For 3 years, looters, dealers, and buyers moved the object around while the evidence around it had already been broken apart. In the summer of 1999, 2 illegal metal detectorists dug into the summit of Middelburg. They were not excavating carefully. They were ripping metal out of the ground. They struck the disc hard enough to damage it. Soil was thrown aside. The arrangement of the objects was lost. Yet what they pulled out was not a random scrap of bronze. It was a worked image of the sky from early Bronze Age central Germany, from a place where nobody expects a cosmic diagram in gold. That is the first shock. Around 1600 BC, the formal astronomy most people trust from the surviving record belongs to places like Egypt and Mesopotamia. But this object surfaced hundreds of miles to the northwest, on a hill in Germany, with no alphabet attached and no text to explain it. Investigators had to rebuild the case from fragments, not from a clean excavation, from residue. Soil samples on the objects were compared with soil from Middelburg. The associated finds mattered because swords and axes can be typologically dated even when a disc cannot speak for itself. The corrosion products mattered. The cuts in the ground mattered. The testimony of criminals mattered too, which is never ideal. Piece by piece, archaeologists argued that the disc and the weapons belonged to one buried hoard, not a dealer's mixed lot. The irony is plain. The image looks advanced, but the knowledge most needed to understand it was not in the bronze. It was in the layer of dirt the looters destroyed. Now look closer at the disc itself. It was not made in one pass. Metallurgical work published in 2024 indicates a cast preform that was repeatedly hot forged, roughly 10 heating and forging cycles, before the final shape emerged. So even before the gold symbols were added, somebody knew how to control metal, heat, and hammering with precision. Then the image changed over time. Museum researchers divide its history into 5 phases. First came the basic sky, the crescent, the round disc, and 32 stars. Later, 2 horizon arcs were added at the edges. Some stars were covered in the process. Later still, another arc appeared below, often described as a feathered or boat-shaped form. Later still, holes were punched around the rim, perhaps so the disc could be mounted or carried. This was not a single frozen masterpiece. It was edited, revised, reused. That detail is easy to miss, but it changes the object completely. People love to call it a star map because that sounds clean. One image, one meaning. One moment of revelation. But the disc behaves more like a working instrument in symbolic form, altered as its role changed. First a sky picture, then a horizon device, then something ritual, portable, or both. Knowledge layered over knowledge. If that reading is right, the disc is not simply showing the heavens. It is preserving a tradition of adjustment, the kind of practical expertise that takes generations to build and only one badly aimed shovel to scramble. The long-distance numbers are just as strange. Provenance studies link the copper to alpine sources. The tin and some of the gold have been connected by researchers to southwest Britain, especially Cornwall. So the object found on one hill in central Germany may carry metal from hundreds of miles away in several directions. Bronze Age Europe was not a patchwork of isolated villages staring only at local fields. It was exchange, roots, transfer, raw materials moving farther than many later myths allow. If the dominant interpretation holds, the wrong place feeling belongs to us, not to them. We expect sophistication to live only where texts survive. This disc points to technical and cosmic knowledge moving across Europe without leaving a library behind. And yet the case never became perfectly clean. In 2020, a challenge argued that the disc might not belong to an intact early Bronze Age hoard from Middelburg at all, and could be a later, possibly Iron Age, isolated object. That matters because the entire meaning of the disc hangs on provenience. If the hoard is genuine, the image blows apart the old map of where sophisticated sky knowledge could appear. If the association fails, the object becomes harder to place and easier to mythologize. So the debate is not a side issue, it is the issue. Not whether the disc is impressive, but whether the story wrapped around it is anchored to the ground or dragged loose from it. The dominant position from the museum, Associated Studies, and UNESCO still supports the Bronze Age Middelburg context, the soil links, the associated weapons, the reconstruction of the find spot, the dating of the hoard. Together, they form the argument. But notice what had to happen to make that argument at all. Archaeologists were forced to do forensics on absence. They had to measure what was no longer where it should have been. A 32-centimeter disc became famous worldwide, but the real labor was done by dirt traces, damaged context, and the inventory of what the looters carried out with it. 2 swords, 2 axes, 2 arm spirals, 1 chisel. Years after the crime, the object had survived. The circumstance almost had not. The pattern is brutal. Hard-won understanding can persist in metal for 3,600 years. The chain explaining it can vanish in a single afternoon on a hilltop. The sky was not the fragile part. The context was. 1 disc, 5 phases, 10 forging cycles, 3 lost years, and 1 destroyed hole in the ground. Number 1. Antikythera Mechanism. Around Easter 1900, Captain Dimitrios Kondos dropped anchor off the rocky island of Antikythera after a storm drove his sponge diving boat off course. He and his crew from Simi wanted shelter between Crete and the Peloponnese. Instead, they found a graveyard in 45 meters of water. Diver Elias Stadiatis went down first in his heavy suit and copper helmet. When he came back up, he was shaken. There were bodies on the seabed, he said. Kondos thought the depth had scrambled the man's senses, so he went down himself. He came back holding a bronze arm. The bodies were statues. Life-size bronze and marble figures lay scattered across a Roman-era luxury cargo wreck that had gone down sometime around 70 to 60 BCE. In 1900 and 1901, with help from the Greek Navy, the divers hauled up a museum's worth of treasure: sculptures, amphorae, coins, glassware, jewelry. Mixed in with it was a corroded lump of bronze, ugly and broken, so unpromising that nobody treated it as the prize of the find. It looked like debris, the sort of thing you catalog only because it came up with the good material. Take that lump seriously, and the whole picture changes. Maybe it was not a one-off marvel built by a genius no one copied. Maybe it was ordinary equipment for a vanished class of experts, not something sold in every market stall, but something normal in the hands of people who needed to predict the sky, align calendars, and coordinate civic life. If that is true, then a full technical tradition once existed in the Hellenistic world. It had workshops, training, prototypes, mistakes, repairs, and customers. Almost all of it disappeared so completely that one shipwreck has to speak for the rest. The wreckage carries the numbers. Not one gear. At least 30 surviving bronze gears identified across 82 fragments. Not a decorative wheel, but a compact gear train packed into a portable, hand-powered instrument. On the back, one dial tracks 235 lunar months, the 19-year Metonic cycle that reconciles lunar months with the solar year. Another tracks 223 lunar months, the Saros cycle used to predict eclipses. Turn a handle and the gears move. Calendars shift. The moon's motion is modeled. Eclipse possibilities appear. The device also marked festival cycles, including Pan-Hellenic games, tying astronomy to the schedule of public life. Sky, time, and society sat in one box. The shock is not the seabed off a small Greek island. The shock is the timeline. For generations, surviving ancient machinery gave no warning that this level of miniaturized gearing existed. Statues, yes. Temples, yes. Mathematical texts, yes. But a hand-powered astronomical calculator with interlocking bronze teeth fine enough to encode long cycles of the heavens hits the historical record like a steel watch in a Bronze Age tomb. It almost entered history as a nuisance hidden among masterpieces. In May 1902, at the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, archaeologist Valerios Stais examined the corroded fragments from Antikythera. He noticed something no statue should have inside it: a gear, a literal toothed wheel embedded in the bronze. In that instant, the object stopped being salvage and became a problem. A gear forces precision. It means design, ratios, intent, a system. For decades, the mechanism remained half visible and half unbelievable. Scholars could tell it was mechanical, but corrosion locked most of its logic inside a mineral shell. The argument stalled at the edge of proof. Ancient texts mentioned sophisticated devices by figures like Archimedes and Posidonius, but texts are cheap in disputes like this. A writer may have exaggerated. A reader may have misunderstood. Bronze teeth with fixed counts are different. They either mesh or they do not. The case moved forward by opening the body without destroying it. In 2005, a new imaging campaign used high-resolution X-ray tomography to see inside the fragments. The 2006 Nature paper that followed turned rumor into mechanism. Researchers could read far more of the inscriptions. They could trace internal gear trains. They could identify functions that had only been guessed at before. the back dials, the eclipse cycle, the calendar system, the link between numerical astronomy and lived time. This device did not merely point at stars, it organized prediction. Picture it in your hands, a box not much larger than a shoebox, bronze plates, tiny gearwork, inscribed instructions. You turn the side knob. The face advances through months and constellations. The rear spirals step through years of cycles. This is not a philosopher speaking about cosmic order. This is a user operating a machine. Someone expected a trained person to read it, set it, and trust it. Follow that one fact. If the device had to be explained to its owner, then there were teachers. If there were teachers, there were students. If there were students, there were methods. If there were methods, someone benefited from keeping that knowledge concentrated in courts, schools, workshops, observatories, or ports where astronomy was not a hobby, but infrastructure. Hard-won knowledge vanished almost without a trace. The Antikythera Mechanism does not look like the beginning of a technology. It looks like one surviving corner of it, and surviving is the key word. The ship that carried it was loaded with elite goods, art for Roman buyers, wealth in transit. The mechanism traveled with that cargo like just another high-value object. Then the vessel went down and sealed everything in darkness. Salt ate the wood. Metal fused into lumps. The workshop that made the machine is gone. The bench where it was calibrated is gone. The hands that cut its teeth are gone. Even its exact origin is still debated. Rhodes, Syracuse, somewhere else in the Hellenistic world. Its original calibration date may have been 204 BCE or 178 BCE. We do not know. We have output without a surviving factory, sophistication without a surviving industry. So, when people call it an ancient computer, the label helps, but it is still too small. A computer can be a miracle gadget. This is evidence. Evidence that the ancient Mediterranean did not merely imagine mathematical precision in the sky. It built that precision into bronze and carried it from harbor to harbor, not as myth, as hardware. The narrowest part of the story came later. If Staius had not noticed that embedded gear in May 1902, the mechanism might have sat in storage as a crusted curiosity while the statues took all the light. A lost science nearly vanished twice, first in the sinking, then in the catalog. The Antikythera Mechanism was found centuries out of place. Staius saw it in the plainest possible terms, a bronze gear wheel.